Hi, everybody. Today I'm going to tell you about the Roman economy. Um, and this meme will become more important here in a second. So, the main idea of this presentation is to tell you that about the Roman economy, and that it was a mostly agrarian, but it had a lot of other industries to support this. But it was a mostly agrarian economy, with the most important being grain farming. And we'll talk about how grain farming basically made the Roman Empire extremely rich. It was probably the most important um, industry in the empire. The Roman economy was extremely reliant on slave labor, um, as well as it was heavily important in facilitating and creating trade networks, and it was extremely robust and complex for most of its history. And we'll talk about when it wasn't robust towards the end. So let's talk about the major industries in Rome. The major industries in Rome are going to be farming, timber, and mining. Farming is easily the most important. Um, Timber and mining, you could debate over which is more important. Um, Timber is obviously important because construction, you need wood. Mining is obviously important because tools, um, swords for fighting, and Rome liked to fight, so they needed stuff like that. So let's talk about farming first. So farming, agriculture in Rome. Um, Grain was easily the most important crop of Rome, as 70 to 80% as researchers estimate, 70 to 80% of the diet of an average Roman was actually grain. So grain was extremely important in feeding people, because it was about 70 to 80% of their diet. It was the vast majority of their diet. So it was obviously in high demand. The main crops were initially millet, emmer, and spelt. These are three different species of wheat. Um, but common wheat and durum um, were said to have arrived at around 450 BC to Italy. This is according to the Roman scholar Varro. And there were two different types of wheat: durum, which is hard wheat, and common wheat, which is soft wheat. And common wheat is more prevalent today, but durum wheat was actually more prevalent back then because it grows better in Mediterranean climates, and back then it was easier to make into bread. And so grain was going to be your most important, and we'll talk in a little bit about how grain was actually a really important strategic resource when Rome looked at conquering different regions. Um, they conquered a lot of grain producing regions because actually most of the grain in the empire was not produced in Italy, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. Grapes. Grapes were extremely important. They were because they made wine, and as I like to put it, wine was basically the Coca-Cola of the Roman Empire, except it was probably even more prevalent than that because everyone drank wine. Kids drank wine. Wine was just the beverage. And so grapes were really important because of that. Rome was actually able to learn how to cultivate grapes from Carthage. And by 160 BC, large plantations were harvesting grapes using slave labor all across Italy, and they made wine the common drink of the Roman Empire. And actually, that brings us to the latifundia, which was a Roman plantation. The latifundia was extremely important. It um, it was extremely important because it produced crops on a large scale, and it worked just like you would think a plantation would work. A family or a rich person owns the plantation, has everything harvested by slave labor for the most part, and it produced things on a large scale and was a very good development for the Roman economy. The next one is olives. Olives were an important crop in Rome because olives grow well in warm climates with rocky and dry soils, and that was basically most of the Mediterranean. Um, so olive oil was very actually important, and they say that olive oil was about 12% of the uh, Romans' caloric intake. So about 12% of the average Roman's diet was olive oil. So this was very important to Rome. Um, Another important crop would be your animal fodder crop, stuff you feed to your animals. And uh, Lucius Junius Moderatus Columella was a Roman author who wrote very prevalently about agriculture, wrote various handbooks and stuff like that. Um, he said that turnips were actually the most important animal fodder crop, but there were also, and these were mostly grown, turnips were mostly grown throughout Gaul because that was where most of the animal farming took place. But it was mostly Gaul where turnips were grown. And he also mentioned some other ones: clover, vetch, barley, cytisus, oats, chickpea, and others. And an interesting one is he actually noted that clover was an important cover crop. And what a cover crop is when your plant that you are growing is not in season, you plant another plant like clover, and it fixates nutrients into the ground so that your main crop that you're growing actually grows better. And this tells you how advanced Roman agriculture was. Um, Columella lived from 480 to 70 AD, and he noted that in his manuals that clover was actually a good cover crop. So they understood that it would fixate nutrients into the soil and make the um, plants grow better. And they also grew a lot of other crops, um, but none of them were major crops like the ones I mentioned before. Some of these are artichokes, mint, thyme, beets, cucumber, lettuce, plums, peaches, stuff like that. But these were never major crops. Um, timber. Timber's the next industry. Timber was the Romans used species of, for the most part, coniferous trees in southern Italy. This is the umbrella pine. This is one of the trees that they would probably use most likely. Um, and there was some excavation of a city near Naples called Herculaneum. Herculaneum was buried by a volcano, and excavating that helped us understand Roman timber and construction a lot. And they figured out that it was these types of trees that they mostly used. And an interesting thing was they were, because of that research, they were able to later find that on the latifundia, on the plantations, oftentimes these trees would be grown as crops like plantations. So the Romans were very advanced with their timber. The next one was mining. This is a Roman gold mine that would be in modern day Romania. It's called Rosia Montana. Um, and it was mostly slave labor was the most common source of labor. So initially, Rome had no sources of significant. They didn't have significant sources of metal. They practiced metallurgy since the Bronze Age, but it was never a major industry just because they lacked the resources to make it one. However, when they conquered Tuscany, Cisalpine Gaul, Elba, and Sardinia, they encountered really important. They encountered really important areas of with significant sources of metals, and that made a important mining industry in Rome that ended up making Rome a lot of money. And so those were the first ones that started their mining industry. Um, Stuff like lead and iron were harvested in these areas, but another important one was salt, which was actually harvested in the Alps. And salt was very important because basically everybody in Rome salted their food, and so salt was very valuable for that reason. And then after the Punic Wars, once Rome acquired Iberia, their mining industry really took off because Iberia is a very rich place with ore. Silver, gold, copper, tin, lead, and iron are all mined in Iberia, and this made Iberia probably the most important mining region to the empire. Gaul also had um, stuff like silver, gold, copper, and lead, um, but Iberia is probably your most important mining region. So let's talk about the important economic regions. You have your commercial center, which is Italy, your breadbasket, where most of the grain is grown, and North Africa, Egypt, and Sicily, and Britannia, Gaul, and Iberia being your important mining regions. Um, so first, let's talk about Italy. All roads lead to Rome. This is very true in this case because a lot of raw materials were sent to Rome and later distributed after being sent to Rome or turned into artisan goods there in Rome. Um, that was basically how trade worked in Rome. Everything raw materials got sent to Rome. So Rome was the epicenter of all commerce in the Roman Empire because of trade from all the various regions. Um, and Italy became very rich because, as I said earlier, they were the wine basket, as I would put it, because they banned all of the other regions of the empire from producing grapes for a while, and so they got very rich producing wine for many years. So then we'll talk about the breadbasket. Um, that's going to be North Africa, Egypt, and Sicily. This is very important. These are the biggest grain producing parts of the empire, fed most of the empire through these regions, um, which is interesting because I don't think people would think of places like Egypt and places like North Africa being big farming regions, but they were. And this map is pretty funny, but there's some accuracy here. So they say we got him here from Carthage. Carthage was one of the very important grain producing regions. Um, a lot of grain was produced in Carthage. And over here, Egypt is the big breadbasket. That's very important as well. Um, and Sicily's the little breadbasket. So these regions basically fed the entire empire. And it was very strategic that Rome took control of these grain producing regions because, as I said before, grain is what made you rich because everybody needed it, and so and it was a very easy source of food, and so Rome got rich from these regions producing grain. The mining regions, that's going to be Britannia, Gaul, and Iberia, probably the biggest one being Iberia, and it supplied Rome with most of its metals. And these regions signify that Rome was extremely reliant on imports from other regions because Italy by itself didn't produce a lot of these things. Specifically, metal is the big one because the vast majority of metal came from other places, and grain as well. So we talked about the important industries of Rome. Now we're going to talk about the monetary system, which means money. How did people in Rome buy things? So obviously, it began with bartering. I trade my goats for your chickens and stuff like that. But then they started with the ius rude, which was a chunk of bronze, and they traded those. And then they had their first kind of coin, and I use the term coin very loosely. The ius signatum, and the most important currency is going to be the silver denarius. That was the currency for 500 years. And then with Antoninus, he established his own currency. And later on, they kept changing the currency and made it worthless. And that's going to lead to a lot of the problems with the Roman economy towards the end. So the ius rude, this means raw bronze, and from around roughly 500 BC to 200 BC, that's when they were producing it. Bartering became impractical because Rome got huge, and so people began to trade these giant chunks of bronze. And usually they would just reuse this as money, but a lot of people would also melt them down and sell it again as raw materials. And then the ius signatum, which means signed bronze, roughly 300ish BC to 200ish BC. This is the first quote-unquote coin, but don't think of it as a coin you put in your pocket. Think of it as a giant chunk of bronze. Rectangles of bronze were stamped with a picture to signify that it was currency. And this was the first, you know, dollar bill coin kind of thing in Rome, where people used it specifically with the express purpose of buying things. And then the most important currency is the silver denarius. This was actively used for 5 centuries, like I said. It was it was originally valued at 10 asses. Asses, not donkeys or behinds. Asses being pieces of bronze. But in 118 BC, it was revalued at 16 asses because bronze and copper became more rare, and so they had to adjust for that. But the important thing is that as time went on, these coins contained less and less silver, and that posed a problem because it made them less valuable. And so the first change away from the denarius was in 215 AD. Antoninus, because the denarius had fallen to less than 50% silver, he introduced a 60% silver currency, the Antoninius. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Um, but later on, this is a good picture because you can see it's less and less silver as time goes on. And due to the war cost, the silver mints were actually debased, which caused the currency to severely drop in value. And at around 250 AD, so in short amount, 35 years, the Antoninus was around only 20 to 40% silver because of all this war costs, and that caused a lot of problems for Rome. And there's actually an interesting case where um, the Emperor Valerian was actually captured in the war in the East, and his son was running the place while he got captured. And he actually just started making money like crazy. And he made the Antoninus, but it was a bronze coin that was just coated in silver, so it was extremely worthless. And he got to a point where he was making 1 million of them a day to try to pay to finance this war, and it was not good for Rome, and that's going to lead into the downfall of Rome, actually. But Roman labor, slavery was the dominant form of labor. It wasn't based on race or anything like that. Anyone could be a slave. Usually, it was slave traders that would follow armies and buy slaves from the armies. Um, they call Roman slavery an open slavery model, which means that slaves generally had the ability to later become free, but it was often very hard. And slavery was very important. Around the first century, Italy's population was estimated to be 30 to 40% slaves. Um, and the labor market, as it would be, the economic definition of a labor market means that the laborer actually has to be able to choose, have some choice of where they can go. That was basically non existent due to family and guild restrictions. You basically couldn't go anywhere. So the labor market was only exist on a small scale, very local, but for the most part, it didn't exist. So let's talk about the economic downfall of Rome. The main things being political instability, the Antonine Plague, awful monetary policy, as we talked before, and this all caused significant rise in prices, which is inflation in economic terms. So political instability, year of the 4, 5, 6 emperors, various rebellions caused disruption of Rome's trade networks because various different people controlled different areas. Um, and that caused a lot of issues, as well as general uncertainty and stuff like that. And war devastation caused a lot of shortages and prices to rise. The Antonine Plague epidemic killed as many as a third of the populations in certain regions. Panic, shortages, and dead people who can't work caused prices to generally rise. And finally, bad monetary policy. Coins are overproduced, which made them extremely worthless and made a lot of people very poor. Um, and so this is an overview of the economy of Rome. Thank you for watching.